Good afternoon, everybody. Last session of the day. All right, so I'm here to talk to you about distributed energy resources and securing them with networks in California. Now, distributed energy resources, also known as DER, these are PV and storage systems, so photovoltaic solar systems that are typically installed on rooftops. So my discussion today, I'm not going to be talking about the large utility scale solar installations, but strictly the ones that come in on the rooftops. And as this is an evolving story, meaning that the requirement for distributed energy resources to communicate doesn't take effect until March of this year, I'm going to give you a backstory about how we got here and what we're doing to prepare what we're doing in the field here to secure these resources. And let's see. And I figured out how to use the clicker. Awesome. Well, the road to distributed and networked and secured resources all started in Germany in 2008. Now, this was at the height of the feed-in tariff initiative in Germany, and so the Germans were selling a lot of solar at that point. And so we were finding very large concentrations of solar systems on certain distribution feeders. And so with these high concentrations of distributed energy resources on certain feeders, what happened is, given the rigid grid control standards of the day, Germany encountered this problem that's now known as the 50.2 hertz problem. Once the inverters hit that threshold on high concentration areas, they would trip off. And so you'd have large portions of the network just simply disappearing. And so in about 2010, California decided to adopt its policies to favor things like rooftop solar, and it recognized this problem. Now, given the time frame between 2008 and 2010, there really wasn't enough time for the US national standard, the IEEE 1547 standard, to adjust and to adopt for distributed energy resources and for smart inverters. And so California has to do something on its own. So the road went straight from Germany and landed in California. Then in about 2012, the California Public Utility Commission, seeing that the national standard wasn't going to move, convened what they called the Smart Inverter Working Group. Now that group worked, it continues to this day in innovating and developing new technologies. So at this period of time, we worked out the functional requirements for what did the inverters need to do. We came up with network topology designs to accommodate for the fact that the utilities no longer owned all the distributed energy resources. We came up with some data in flight requirements. This was considered to be the top priority of securing data in flight. And we did an initial vulnerability assessment. Regulations were put in place. Manufacturers went to work. And given the momentum that started in Germany, it wasn't too difficult for the manufacturing industry to adapt to get the right functional behavior out of these inverters. But now the next step was to really land the network requirements. So California independently at that point decided to select another IEEE standard, which is a TCP/IP-based standard called IEEE 2030.5 as the default control mechanism. Once that was done, we were able to refine the network to the next level and determine what aspects of IEEE 2030.5 were required in order to control these distributed energy resources, because 2030.5 can handle things like pool pumps, loads inside of houses, electric vehicles, and so forth. All that was considered to be out of scope. So California came up and led this thing, the development of a standard called the Common Smart Inverter Profile. Now, I'm giving you a lot of detail and background, but it goes to the main aspect of the story, which is security has been considered throughout and through a consistent narrowing and focusing of scope. With the combination of the protocol and the profile defined, the utilities themselves were able to do and access control requirements around utility servers. SunSpec then came up with smart inverter test procedures, and this would be something that would give certainty to the manufacturers that once they got through the process of making sure that the protocols conformed to the standard, they worked according to the CSIP, that they would then be allowed and eligible for installation in the California grid. At that time, right about the time we published the CSIP, the national standard actually caught up. And so a lot of people were scratching their heads and wondering, well, why did we spend all of our time doing this? But, well, the answer was to actually make the national standard happen. So all this sets the stage for California to start the project, but then it rolls out across the United States. Actually, in 2019, there was a lot of hand-wringing that went on and a lot of debating about when are the implementation dates going to be. The actual phase 1 requirements for the autonomous functions, that actually occurred in 2017. So, but somehow it ended up there. But finally, in the year 2020 now, in March, we're going to have the phase 2 requirements, and that is for the distributed energy resources to communicate will occur just in a few months' time. So around the same time, we're now going to have the testing standard for the U.S. National Standard 1547, which means the rest of the country will not be far behind California in rolling out this type of a network. All right, so how did California get the job done? Really on the back of three things. First was policy. So there's three specific laws that California put in place that made sure that distributed energy resources was going to be a big fraction of how the state powered its homes, its building, and its industries. Of course, the technology component, Silicon Valley sort of kicked in as well. So a lot of the power conversion companies are based right there, and so we were all over this type of stuff. It was a great business opportunity. And we then forced the development of the national standard. All this has resulted in robust market share. So California's got about 1 million of these distributed energy resource PV systems installed right now. And based upon all these new laws that are occurring, there's going to be about another 250,000 coming into the system every year now, and henceforth they're going to be networked, and they're going to be networked using TCP/IP networks. So what does this mean for the national picture? National picture, we have about 2 million total DER systems, and that was at the end of the second quarter of 2019. In the intervening period, we've added another 250,000. So we see about 125,000 new systems coming online every quarter now. So you can do the math. California is effectively going to take about half the total pie here. The rest of the country will get the remainder. But the point is that we're going to have, moving forward, about 500,000 new pieces of equipment that are communicating on a consistent basis in a very short period of time. And so what you can see from there is that we're building up a very large network and therefore a very large attack surface. So let's talk about the complexion of that attack surface. In the California context with the Common Smart Inverter profile, they've defined 3 distinct paths for distributed energy resources to communicate back to the utility. One is directly from the DER system to the utility server. This is actually the least preferable path from the utility standpoint that doesn't really want the responsibility of interacting with all these small systems. And so there are 2 other pathways. One is through an energy management system, which may be on a premise, so this is for a large campus. And for the residential systems, most of those will be aggregated. And so you can have these aggregated systems that may represent 50,000, 100,000 or more units at any one time. Now, the pathway, at least as it stands today, for the 23.5 protocol is between the utility server and the next closest hop. So in the direct connect, that's to the DER system, but in these other cases, it's to an intermediate system. Everything beyond the intermediate system is out of scope in the current regulations, which is a different security problem that I'll deal with on a different day. All right. But in any case, these are the 3 common pathways, and they're being set up and implemented now. The 2030.5 system operates on this concept of mutual authentication. So the entire network is supported with TLS 1.2, and there are digital certificates that are installed on the intermediate systems, utility servers, and the end devices. And they trade their credentials, and so one can authenticate to another. So this is, I think, relatively unusual. Usually it's a one-way authentication, but in this way it's 2 ways, and for good reason. One is the utility or the controlling entity is looking to monitor what's happening out on the grid, and based upon the conditions it sees, has the ability to change the watts, the power, the current, the voltage, etc. So again, coming back to the story, once we have 50,000, 100,000, a million units out there, one can see that if you're controlling voltage or having the ability to connect and disconnect systems, you could wreak havoc in this type of a system without the proper controls put in place. So this is an exciting time, and we're about to build this network. Now, so with all these risks, well, why would you do it? Well, there's a few different reasons for this. One is it's a reality that generating assets for power are no longer going to be controlled by the utilities. They're going to be independently owned. And this is a good thing, because now when we have an opportunity, let's say a new town gets built, a new employer moves into town, and manufacturer comes into town, we don't have to wait around for the power. We can install power generating equipment right in place and get the system up and going. Of course, businesses can operate, families can carry on with their lives. Secondly, the system allows for multi-party management and multi-outcome optimization. So what does that mean? So for one thing, given this independent ownership, an owner, in the case of a storm coming in, could say, I'm not going to play on the grid. I'm not going to allow the utility to interact with me, because I'm going to save all the energy that I have, and I'm going to put it into my battery because I see a storm's coming in for the next 3 days, and so I'm going to opt out. So that's one thing that can happen. From the utility side, that are looking at the same conditions, they can now adjust settings on their larger grid to forestall the period of time in which the grid actually might fail by doing some subtle adjustment. So there's some opportunities there. And then finally, we get this concept of energy arbitrage. So the independent system operators, there are 6 balancing areas in this country, as probably many of you know, and each one of them has their own sets of demands that they're dealing with that are independent of the utility. And so this sets up a potential for a different business relationship for the owners of the generating assets. And all that's possible because of this networking type of system and a standard being put in place. Now, I call this IEEE 2030.5 a security challenge for all, but really it's network DER is the challenge for all. The reason why I say that is that the scope for the IEEE 2030.5 standard, as it's mandated by the regulation, is pretty narrow. It's really just to control the interaction between the utility and the intermediate systems, or the DER itself. It doesn't account for all the other interactions that these assets are going to have. So where we have manufacturers that are updating firmware, you have the operating managers that are monitoring for optimization, financial optimization, and the like. You may have also the energy commissions that have a piece in the party or the transaction that are feeding certain data to the utility to inform it to exert certain behaviors out on this network. And so you have what is potentially chaos here, because you have only one part that's spec'd out, and really the rest of it's sort of the Wild West. So a potential upside here is that you get a broader adoption of the IEEE 2030.5 standard, so you get more people operating effectively in the same application layer protocol, but maybe not. And so this is the future that is present in small scale here and is going to be pervasive very soon. And it's basically all new for everybody. So we're spending a lot of time looking at, the whole industry is looking at all these different issues and making sure that what we're doing is going to keep our industry, and I represent the DER industry, going and keep the lights on at the same time. So how do we do that? SunSpec operates on the basis that if we can create information standards and we can deploy them on a uniform basis, we can drive down costs, we can drive up innovation, and we can make the whole system secure. It's secure enough to keep going to get the process started in any case. So the way that we operate here is on the concept of interface certification. So here you have DER systems, solar plus storage. You may have standalone storage also that would qualify here. You have, of course, the utility servers and these independent entities that are aggregating. And then finally, you have EVs and charging stations. All that are likely to end up on this particular network. Now, the manufacturers and software developers would take their products to a SunSpec authorized testing laboratory. They'd use our conformance and compliance test criteria to evaluate these devices. Then once they're done and they think everything's in good shape, they send us the protocol log. We decompose the protocol log and make sure that the transactions occurred the way that they're supposed to according to the spec. And we issue a certificate saying that this unit is good to be installed in the network. Second thing that certificate allows the manufacturer to do is to participate in the public key infrastructure that SunSpec has also set up. So then we will connect the manufacturer or the software developer with our service provider. In this case, we use Sectigo to acquire certificates in bulk and then apply them in the factory line on devices as they're headed out to the field. So with that type of a system, you have interface validation where it's pinned down to a particular software build that's hashed and so forth. We have a vetted manufacturers that have made certain declarations about what's going into these products, how they're building, how often they're updating them, and then, of course, the security for the end user in terms of the digital certificate on their device. So to review the whole process, so for SunSpec and for our members to get into the PKI, it all starts with accessing our PKI infrastructure, including our test infrastructure. They get test PKI certificates. Of course, they build their product. Once their product they believe is in good shape, they take it to a test lab. Test lab sends us the results. We evaluate the results. We issue the mark, get them onto the production PKI, and the devices roll out into the field. So that's a quick summary. All right, so to help our member customers work, we've published this Common Smart Inverter Protocol test procedures. It's all available for free download, and so it's a highly audited situation. And then we offer a variety of resources around a test PKI, where of course, there's the ability to generate test certificates yourself, including all the ones that you need for the negative tests. There's an application note describing how to go through the whole process. And then, of course, there's information on the public key infrastructure that lays out the responsibilities for who's checking what and who's responsible for what in terms of the overall security of the PKI itself, which it turns out is really, in the near term, the most important security issue that we're dealing with is just locking down this PKI. And so these are some of the test labs that we work with. The bottom line is it's all the global leaders here. We have certifications taking place in each one. Now, why is the PKI itself the most critical aspect here? Well, the 2030.5 standard lays out a very particular key structure and trust chain. So naturally, the root certificate authority is offline. And then there's a series of sub-CAs. So the sub-CAs are software developers, or more likely, they're one of the global manufacturers. And so these global manufacturers, they're acquiring these certificates in bulk, and that can happen in a variety of different ways. They could be handled, a physical package. They can acquire them over a secure web service. But in any case, there is a handoff that takes place. And then certificates, maybe 10,000 of them, 20,000 of them, end up on a manufacturing site, some part of the world. Maybe it's in Europe, maybe it's in some other country, I don't know, but these certificates are in bulk. And so if that aspect of the supply chain is compromised, then you have the possibility for counterfeiting and so forth, and obviously that's no good. So the sub-CAs then have the responsibility, after having had their devices tested and certified, of applying those certificates onto the devices. They then go into the supply chain, and they ultimately end up on a rooftop in California or a rooftop in Florida, and away we go. Now, since it's all chained back to the same root, this concept of mutual authentication is able to occur. The whole point is you take a system that is currently completely unsecured, you vet every piece of it, and you end up with a system, at least over the wire, you have a pretty good idea of who the different players are and what types of interactions they're allowed to make in this system, and you have a pretty good idea of when people are not acting in the right way. you end up with a trusted ecosystem, which is the end goal. This occurs through this close monitoring of this ecosystem, and frankly, limiting the number of trusted routes, because that just adds cost and complexity when you have, it certainly adds a lot of complexity for the manufacturers that have a hard time distinguishing whether this widget that's coming out of some factory in Frankfurt is going to Florida or to Austria or to some other place. So they want certainty there. And so that's the whole point. Where we stand today, about 20 companies are in process. The underlying system is TLS 1.2. That's just built into the communication standard itself. The elliptical cryptography keys are used for TLS, so it's state-of-the-art in terms of the encryption. I mentioned that Sectigo is our service provider, and we have validated this system and put it through stress tests and quite a number of California Energy Commission trials. And so it's not like we haven't installed any, but we've installed maybe 100 or so of these systems in California and put them through the paces. And the bottom line is that given this limited experience, the things that you would typically think of as a network cybersecurity threat really don't hit the threshold of concern at this point, because it's other things like sub-CA supply chain administration. So specifically developing the protocols and the auditing procedures such that we can entrust a manufacturer, even if it's a Schneider or an ABB or something like that, to take responsibility for this cryptographic material and make sure it doesn't get into the wrong hands. A non-trivial exercise. Also involves something that these companies are not used to doing, which is maintaining this type of material. Quite often they've been operating obliviously to the fact that security is even part of their job. It's usually happened by an installer somewhere out in the field. Now it's all happening back in the factory. The second order of challenge that we see, of course, are in these aggregation systems. Now, the utility server is the most obvious target, because you get to that one, you get them all. Good news here is that the utility servers themselves, they are operating, generating assets, so those systems are already somewhat hardened. Although this pathway into the data center is a brand new one, and the protocol is also a brand new one. And so because these utilities tend to be so siloed, this is almost like a fresh, brand new endeavor. And then you have the aggregators, which are primarily considered to be independent third parties. No vetting's been done on them. So many of these are startup companies, or maybe they're the manufacturers themselves. And so that's another area where considerable hardening is required. And you can see here that the emphasis right now is really just on best practices. But given the size of the footprint, the attack surface that we're creating, obviously this is something that we are very concerned about getting right. The third order concern here all orients around the client. Now, if you were to read the popular press, all the cybersecurity exploits that you read about have to do with client exploits. I mean, and these are really fantastic. You know, somebody hacked my roof, and a million people have the same configuration, the sky's going to fall. Well, the truth of the matter is it's a little bit different than that. Frankly, there's so little distributed energy in the electrical grid now that even the compromise of a few or even a few hundred of these types of systems, unless they're in super high concentration, you're not going to even see it. The lights won't flicker, nothing's going to happen, you just won't see it. So as we're getting the system set up, this is why it ends up being sort of a third order affair. So those are the top 3 threats that I've mentioned. Now, the next top 10 threats, you pick up any security book and you're going to see these listed. These are all the garden variety TCP/IP threats. And all this stuff is on the horizon. But by the time that this stuff ends up being really of use and of a key focus, I think for industry, it's going to be a couple of years, because we're going to have to build up the system in the first place. So most of the emphasis is going to be on the supply chain. Now, this is an ICS conference, and so this sounds a little like an ICS problem, but I submit to you that it's not. because the equipment that's getting installed in the field is all relatively low value. And for somebody that's buying this equipment and installing it, a single truck roll can be devastating to the whole financial model. So there's really no opportunity, no time to install these types of cryptographic keys and certificates in the field. It's just simply too costly. We also have a supply chain problem there, is that we're dealing with electricians, and all this so-called low voltage stuff is not their concern. So there's also a whole retooling of that industry that would need to occur. So all this stuff happens back in the factory, and then it's locked down tight and just installed, and the installer waits for the blinky light to come on, and if that goes, then they're good, and they say, okay, this thing is secure, we can walk away from it now. So that's why, again, all the emphasis on the supply chain. 2 years' time, we'll be back here talking about some of these exploits as well, and it'll be more interesting proposition at that point. Okay, now, the way that SunSpec looks about this in terms of the DER cybersecurity threat assessment is kind of the normal one. We look at the probability of the occurrence and the severity of the threat. As you can see in the upper right-hand side, there you have that confluence of high probability, high severity threat. So we got to do something now. And what one thing falls into that category, and that's subsea compromise. You look at the next lower level where, yeah, it's the probability of occurrence is relatively low because the network's not that big, but if something happens, it would be devastating or catastrophic. You have these intentional service compromises, all these things about a bad actor coming at you. Now, these things, we have to monitor them, of course, but they aren't of concern yet because they're not that attractive of a target because there's just not that much there. On the other hand, we have things that are a high probability of occurrence. The severity of the threat is low, but it's time to clean up our act and keep our act in order. And that has to do with accidental compromise, things that could happen to a gateway device, or things that can happen as this IEEE 2030.5 protocol is terminated and goes into a field bus protocol at the local device. Things can happen there by accident, so that needs to get straightened up. And then finally, we have the low impact, no action category, and non-IEEE field bus falls into that category. Again, because the size of these systems are so small and you're dealing with non-routable protocols, so it's not really that big of a concern. So at least for 2020, that's how we see the picture, and that then focuses what our priorities are. To deal with the high impact, high focus area, our members decided to start up a blockchain working group. The first application of this blockchain working group is to secure the supply chain for the PKI infrastructure. So I thought that this is a very kind of a recursive action, but a very interesting one. I mean, everybody sort of converged on this at the same time and said, hey, the way that keys certificates are passed around is highly variable. We need a scripted way to do that, so we need an auditing procedure right out of the get-go, and better yet, because there's so many devices out there, we're going to need to have a way to automate that. So if you're interested, check out the SunSpec Blockchain Working Group. On the low-impact Act Now focus, we are certifying complete gateways now, so the U.S. national standard specs SunSpec Modbus as the profile for the local area, and 2030.5 for the default wide area connection. So we're in a good position to lock all that down. As I mentioned, the Modbus typically operates in the clear. There is a TLS or a secure version of Modbus available, and we'll certify to either one of those standards. And the Modbus, of course, can be fed keys off the same PKI infrastructure that we set up for the 2030.5 system. All right, so we're almost at March 2020, and I'm almost at the end of my time. So what are we going to do from here? So besides, we're going to pop a champagne cork, because this is the better part of a decade that we've been working to get the system put in place. But then the real fun happens. So remember all that stuff in the lower right-hand corner of the threat assessment? This is the time when we start to pay attention to that, specifically the server, the aggregators, subCA hardening, well, that's already happening. But really, all the focus has been on data in flight, not too much in data at rest. So by hardening, that's going to include some physical measures here as well. Client and gateway hardening on the same principle. Code patching. This is a dirty little secret in the DER industry, is that firmware gets updated all the time, sometimes 2 or 3 times a year. And now, if you ask the manufacturers, they say that never happens. But having worked for a couple of those, it happens all the time. And so this is going to have to happen at scale. In Q1 2021, about a year's time, California is going to move from must be able to communicate to we're actually building networks. So there's rulemaking taking place to make that happen, to pay for it. At that point, network auditing, of course, the refinement kicks in. And then phase 3, which will be somewhere in the middle of next year, that's when the utilities are going to implement the controls. And so in the first phase, they'll simply be monitoring, and after that, they're actually going to be doing periodic settings for seasons and things of that nature. And then we'll have a full-on active network, and which is a good thing that we have the national standard that's kicking in at the same time, because also at that time, we'll have products coming out that are compliant to the U.S. national standard. And so what happened in California is going to be replicated at least over the next 25 solar states. And it'll be applicable to all, but the next 25 solar states are going to follow suit. They'll have the same menu of choices, and then we'll build the network even bigger. Okay, and with that, I want to thank you for your time and attention.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions?
What's the lifetime of your cryptographic keys in the field on the edge devices, and how do you update?
Sure. Great question. You probably read the spec.
I'm German.
Okay. Yeah, the certificates for the 2030.5 spec, they never expire.
Oh, great.
Yeah. Yeah, they never expire. So, and yeah, but about 100 people have asked me, it's like, well, how can that work? And why did they do that? So, well, the concept was that this standard would apply to thermostats and other type of devices that nobody had ever opened them up. So the certificates, frankly, are used for identity management primarily. Now, there's nothing in the standard that says you can't have multiple digital certificates. And I'm quite confident, for example, when utilities set up relationships with aggregators, there's going to be more certificates that are traded back and forth.
Can you revoke a compromised certificate?
And no, you cannot, there's no lifetime, and you cannot revoke. The base specified certificate cannot revoke, and it's a lifetime life.
Tom, a follow-on question about the certs. The model you describe is very similar to what was done in Smart Energy 1 back in the day,
Right.
where the cert is treated as kind of a magic set of bytes that ends up getting put into the device.
Right.
Were there any requirements related to the device in terms of the testing and certification about protection of that magic set of bytes? Or is
Right.
that just left as an exercise to the manufacturer?
Left as an exercise to the manufacturer. Now, what I can say about that is SunSpec's stepped into the void, right? I mean, we're on the technical committee for the standard. We see all the same deficiencies that everybody else does. And so putting some governance around that was actually kind of the first thing that we decided to do. And there's also now a steering committee, an ecosystem steering committee, and the next rev of the spec that's going to take some of this work on.
And that's not, those bytes aren't tied to the hardware in any meaningful way at this point?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So the 2030.5 handles the communication aspect of it. What about, are there any other related protections that have been recommended to the manufacturers? So you're going to have a device that's going to have multiple network interfaces and multiple paths to
Sure.
different gateways. So what kind of protection is being suggested, or is it even being discussed within the firmware, within the smart inverter itself?
Sure. We've published standards about locking down ports from a software standpoint. We're extending that down to like eliminating ports on these physical gateway devices. And basically hardening the cases around them. So none of this, again, is standardized, and it's all future-looking, but that's the direction that it's having, is to create these sort of tamper-proof devices.
So when you put certs in a device in the factory, you're of course not just talking about the cert, you have to also put a private key
Correct.
into the device as well. Is there any concern among manufacturers that they're not the person that generates the private key and some other entity has seen the private key?
Typically, the manufacturers are the ones that are administering that. And the ones that aren't are certainly being let know what the risks are associated with
Because
that.
they have a sub-cert
Correct.
certificate, so they can kind of manage that process.
That's right.
So second question, in the sort of the high risk, high probability category, you had sub-CA
Yep.
compromise. Where do vulnerabilities in TLS libraries like fit
Sure.
in that access? Like a kind of
Right.
heartbleed kind of thing where you have to roll out a patch to like half the inverters on the system.
Right. Right. Yeah, right. We got this whole quantum computing thing to deal with, right?
Well, not so much quantum computing, just an actual software bug, like
Sure.
a memory disclosure bug in OpenSSL, for instance.
Right. Right. That is let's just say a point of ongoing research. And so the very next, they call it priority action request on 2030.5 is to consider this topic about how to handle certificate revocation. The time when these decisions were made about key life and so forth, really that was all done around the 2013 time frame, and the world is a lot different than that. I mean, there were concerns about bandwidth constraints and so forth. Also, the environment that was anticipated actually never materialized. So what has materialized for these types of networks are things like cars, DER systems on people's houses, large things, where the ability to actually administer them, while costly now, it's feasible, right? You can devise a system to do that. So right now, that is the risk in place. I think maybe this is also the reason why California is requiring, first of all, a statement that you can communicate in a secure way, but then delaying implementation to perhaps take advantage of the intervening time to straighten out some of these other issues.
Okay, thank you.
You bet. All right. Thanks again for your time, and I think
Too late.
we got one more? Okay.
One quick question.
Okay,
yeah.
yeah, sure.
Did you really want solar on every residential house?
Say it again?
Was there any thought about distributed community type solar facing in the right direction instead of one on every house?
Okay.
And did anybody contemplate using semantic models for the edge devices like the world of 61850 instead of keeping Modbus alive since 1978 and
Okay, two
stuff
questions.
like this?
Two questions. So let me address the first one first about south-facing panels. So of course there's a lot of innovation doing that in terms of modeling and designing. So you get the panels on the right side. What California has done is said all new buildings, including multifamily residential, must have solar starting in 2020. So it doesn't say that they have to be south or southwest facing. However, this type of modeling and in practice it's happening. Secondly, about the 61850 versus the Modbus question. We started SunSpec 10 years ago. The reason was we were having to deal with all these device drivers for inverters. And we thought, oh my God, what can we do to get rid of this Modbus stuff? Okay, and 10 years later, we're saying, oh my God, what can we do to get rid of this Modbus stuff? And it's not going away, right? It's supported everywhere. Now, the reason why it's supported everywhere is it's simple and it doesn't break. The 61850 standard, on the other hand, it was in the lead, and now in this intervening time period, it ends up being the tail on the dog rather than the dog itself. It's an overly complex beast for this application. And so as a result, people are going for things that are going to be simple and that will apply in the most jurisdictions, and so we need to live with Modbus. All right. Great, thank you very much.